We are recapping aggregate demand and aggregate supply. First, let us remember that when we're talking about aggregates, like aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we're talking about all goods and services sold within an economy. So in the United States, we might well be thinking about all goods and services bought or sold in the United States. And you may remember from our class discussion that when we're in this position, we really can't use price, because how would you equate the price of a car with the price of a loaf of bread? And what would matter in the quantity? So instead, we use price level. That's inflationary adjusted price level. And we also use dollar weighted quantity, or GDP, on the horizontal axis. And this allows us to consider things like how much more significant one car is than one loaf of bread. So let's rethink aggregate demand. So remember that we have price level on the vertical axis and we have GDP on the horizontal axis, and aggregate demand is a downward sloping curve, much like our demand curve back in chapter 3. The aggregate demand curve conforms to the law of demand. So it slopes downward. As the price level goes down, consumers demand more. As price level goes up, consumers demand less. The determinants of aggregate demand, the things that cause aggregate demand to change, are consumer spending, which is C from GDP, investment spending, which is I from GDP, and consumer spending means consumer wealth, or it's affected by consumer wealth, the ability of consumers to borrow, taxes that consumers have to pay, real taxes, and consumers' expectations. Meanwhile, investment spending is real interest rates, or it's affected by real interest rates, returns on the investment, and business taxes. Government spending is also a determinant of aggregate demand, as is net export spending. Well, remember that we also considered aggregate supply. So we're considering here what the firms and businesses do and what motivates them to supply. So this curve conforms to the law of supply, and it slopes upward. So as price level rises, suppliers are willing to supply more. As price level falls, suppliers are willing to supply less. The determinants of aggregate supply are resources, and this is quite a broad category here. So I often say that the largest resource that most firms have is labor. But we're talking about materials, labor, anything like that. And we're also talking about both domestic resources and foreign resources. Technology also plays a role in aggregate supply, and technology, since the Middle Ages at least, has always improved and caused suppliers to supply more at every price. Business taxes and business regulation also can affect aggregate supply. So one of the questions on the exam is going to have you draw the three changes in the aggregate demand aggregate supply curve. So to set this up, we're going to start with the immediate short run, and we're going to imagine that the government in the United States invests $1 billion stimulus through military spending. Something like this was actually done in the 1980s. And as we think about the stimulus, we need to remember that the multiplier is going to have an effect. And so the total stimulus, or the total effect of the stimulus, might be more than simply the 1 trillion. Well, if you notice here, we have our standard sloping aggregate demand curve that slopes downward. And we have what I'm sketching here as the current situation. We have 17 trillion in GDP. We have a price level of 100 at today's prices. In other words, if I were to divide today's prices by a 2016 base, I'd get 100. The immediate short run lasts only 0 to 1 month. So almost immediately firms can do things, but in this first month, they really can't. So government announces a surplus, or I'm sorry, a stimulus, but suppliers are frozen for now. They can't change work hours. They have to ask employees. They can't change technology, and the taxes don't change. Now, notice the aggregate supply curve here. So notice that we have a solid purple line between the price level axis and the aggregate demand curve. And then we have a dashed line. Well, the dashed line represents that we like to show this curve horizontal, but truthfully, suppliers aren't going to supply any more than current equilibrium in the market. Well, very quickly, the short run turns to, the immediate short run turns to the short run. So when this happens, we have a new aggregate demand curve. And aggregate demand, because of the stimulus and the multiplier, has pushed up 2 billion. So the stimulus itself was 1 billion, and then I'm assuming here that the multiplier pushed it up another billion. Remember, that's a pretty low multiplier. Typically, if you remember the work we did earlier in the United States, the multiplier would be a lot bigger. Well, now that the aggregate supply curve is sloping up, we're moved from initial equilibrium at aggregate demand, aggregate supply, immediate short run at a price level of 100 and GDP of 17 trillion. And we're pushed upward to GDP of 18 trillion, but a price level of 102. Notice then what happens here is we did not get all 2 trillion immediately of stimulus. Instead, the 2 billion of stimulus only pushed up 1 trillion in GDP. Now, let me rephrase here. Still, this 1 trillion is a lot bigger than the 2 billion stimulus, so it's good. It's just that as we can get the price level down a little later in the process, the stimulus will be much greater. So suppliers at this point can work staff overtime, they can enforce pay cuts, but they can't easily change technology or taxes. The price level goes up, equilibrium shifts right, and this last statement is false. The last little phrase I have in there isn't quite true. The equilibrium shifts right. It could shift further right, but it does shift by a bigger amount than the stimulus. It shifted by 1 trillion, and the stimulus is only 2 billion. Now, in the long run, we have the important moral to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve. So here we are with aggregate supply now totally vertical at yet a third aggregate demand long run curve. And here, aggregate demand long run, aggregate supply long run cross at the current price level in 2016 of 100, even though this might be 5 years out in 2021 or something like that. So in the long run, consumers wanted to pay a reasonable price of 100. Suppliers found ways to get that done, and notice they were able to increase GDP to 21 trillion as a result, where that black circle shows equilibrium. So this period's longer than 5 years. The suppliers can change anything in the long run. They can change overtime, they can change pay rates by shipping jobs overseas, they can change technology, And they could also change taxes. Sorry about missing the N in technology. Also, aggregate demand continues to increase, price level decreases, and GDP goes up 3 trillion. Again, in the long run, producers or suppliers will provide all consumers want at any reasonable price. Take care. Let me know if you have additional questions on aggregate demand, aggregate supply.